Hello, welcome to the next in our online conversation series. My name is Paula Gooder and I'm Canon Chancellor at St Paul's Cathedral and Director of the St Paul's Cathedral Institute. Today I will be talking to Dr. Anna Rowlands, who is the St Hilda Professor of Catholic Social Thought and Practice at Durham University. I hope you enjoy watching our conversation. Anna, it's so great to be able to have this conversation with you today.
Thank you for having me.
So for people who don't know you, can you just explain your connection to the Vatican to us?
Yes, so my background is as a Catholic theologian. So I'm a baptized Christian who happens to be a Roman Catholic. And for the last 3 years, I have had the privilege of working with the Vatican on a process that Pope Francis launched called the Synod on Synodality, which is a chewy phrase, as one journalist put it. It doesn't necessarily sort of easily communicate itself, but it basically was a 3-year process of listening from the grassroots upwards, learning how better to encounter, to listen, and to sort of walk together towards God's kingdom. And I was one of the people who was assisting the Vatican with that huge process.
Really exciting. But let's have a think for a moment about Pope Francis, and then we'll move on to thinking about Pope Leo. Pope Francis was somebody that lots of people just loved. There was something about him that was really attractive. Can you tell us what you think that is?
Yeah, I think that he managed to convey to people a deep sense of his own humanity. And I think people were touched by aspects of his own story. So he was someone who would talk very openly about the fact that he felt that he had failed in important ways in his ministry in Argentina. When he was a Jesuit, and that he had a zeal about learning from that failure and living well with failure. And I think for many people that simply resonated and gave him a sense of being somebody that they could really relate to. I also think that his focus on certain key themes, like, for example, mercy, that he believed that the message that most people needed to really hear was that Christ was offering them mercy, a tender, loving mercy. And that for very many people, they had not felt that was a message that they had heard from the church in their previous encounters. And I think people were drawn very deeply to that deep well of a theology of mercy that he was offering to people. I also think that on the world stage as a political leader, many people were drawn to him because they felt that he was speaking on critical human and ecological issues of our age, on war and peace, on the decent and fair treatment of migrants, on ecology and climate change, on inequalities, on the importance for every human person of what he would call land, labour and lodging, of work and housing, and the ability to own basic property for oneself and one's family. So people felt that he was somehow the world's pastor. Now, sometimes there were people outside the church who seemed to almost like him more than certain sections of the Catholic community itself, which was a certain kind of irony. But I certainly think that he had this extraordinary capacity to form a connection with people where they saw in him something of Jesus Christ.
And he was very good on action, wasn't he, as well as words?
Yes, so I think, from the very earliest days of his papacy, he preached through gesture. What was one of the first visits that he made? To Lampedusa. So he went to the site of a major geopolitical sort of crisis, if you like, of people arriving on the shores of Europe in the most kind of dangerous and risky fashion. And he was there to show closeness both to the people of Lampedusa as well as to those who were arriving on the shores of Europe in various states of both hope and desperation. He also went to prisons, washed the feet of prisoners. He was also threw himself at the feet of world leaders. One of the most compelling images and gestures for me of Francis's papacy was him throwing himself at the leaders of feet of Sudanese leaders, begging them for peace. So I think many of those gestures just spoke profoundly to people. And we do live in a sort of social media age that is much more about the image than it is about the word. And I think that somehow, even as a very elderly Argentinian man, he understood something of what the moment needed.
And you've mentioned that he is really well loved, often by people outside of the Catholic Church. It wasn't quite true for everyone inside the church, was it?
No, and I think that in that sense, he was He was somebody who spoke against polarization, but could also sometimes be a polarizing figure himself. So we should be very clear that the majority of Catholics held an extraordinarily positive view of Pope Francis. Some extremely so, but there was a constituency, and would remain a constituency, who felt in some way alienated by Francis. Often those who felt that what our moment most needed was not necessarily just the message of mercy that Pope Francis was so clearly delivering, but also somebody who could speak with real doctrinal clarity on what they would see as traditional Christian teachings on marriage and family life. And there were also those who radically disagreed with aspects of his social teaching on climate change, on the nature of the nation state and its duties towards the common good, on migration and so forth. And those have become heightened questions really in the Catholic world since his death. Equally, there were those who also felt that on liturgical matters, that he sort of didn't understand something really important about the drive of many younger people, say under 40, towards a more formal liturgical style, which he seemed to be quite irritated by at times almost. So particularly those he felt strongly invested in the provision of a certain form of the Latin Mass. We should be clear that he wasn't against all forms of the Latin Mass, but he did heavily regulate a growing use of a particular form of the Latin Mass. And I think there was something almost quite sort of tragic in the lack of the inability of those two groups to communicate with each other. The groups who were increasingly drawn to that particular form of liturgical celebration, and a pope who didn't really understand what those drivers were, or at least saw that there were very particular risks inherent in matching together, potentially, he thought, a rejection of Vatican II, a kind of what he called a spiritual worldliness. And this is one of the phrases that Pope Francis would repeat over and over again, that he thought that there was this permanent temptation amongst Christians to spiritual worldliness, that you would have an outer piety that was mainly about appearances, and it was much more about religion, if you like, than faith. And he thought that there was a risk that there was a kind of draw to a kind of form of spiritual worldliness that overly focused on the world of the sanctuary, as it were, and the sacristy, and was less focused on the outside world. And one of his most sort of famous interventions, apparently, in the meetings that formed the days before the conclave, where he was elected, was him basically reflecting on the way in which Jesus is knocking on the door of the soul. He's knocking on the door of the sacristy, wanting to be let out. And that became a sort of defining image, really, for Pope Francis's vision of a church that goes forth, that doesn't retreat inside the building, retreat into forms of liturgy alone. Not that he was against liturgy, but a church that goes forth. That's where the church finds its joy. That's where it finds the source of its renewal and its energy. And that emphasis on a kind of joy of a church that goes forth was Francis.
And how much do you think that his time, well, obviously he's from Argentina and he was there at some really key moments in their political history. How did that shape him as a person?
Yeah, I mean, I think it shaped him politically. So I think he had this very strong sense of being bound to a spirituality of the people. And a kind of reverence for popular piety was, again, a hallmark of his time as Pope that I think he brought from those days. He also had a very strong critique of the abuse of power, of false forms of authoritarian politics, and had very little time for that. Also of polarizing politics. So it helped formulate his own very particular view about a politics that goes wrong and goes astray. But equally, he had his own visceral personal journey through that time of feeling that he had betrayed various of his Jesuit colleagues, that he'd failed to stand up for the truth in the way that he should have done, that he was defined by an autocratic, authoritarian style of decision making, that he didn't listen well to others and therefore made poor decisions. And, you know, anybody who's seen the film The Two Popes will have some sense of this narrative, that he spent some time sort of in the wilderness, as it were, attempting to reflect on his own need to transform his way of leading and his way of ministering, basically. And he brought that then into his ministry as the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and then he brought that very much into his experience in Rome. of the papacy. And I think that it gave him this extraordinary sense of a sinner forgiven, somebody who never expected to be Pope, and a sense of urgency about the kind of things where he felt really we were on the, well, not even on the cusp of being part of a change of era, but we were in the middle of a change of era, and the church really could lose no time. So rather than, and I know we'll talk about Leo afterwards, Leo is almost the waiting Pope, and Francis was really the urgent Pope. And I think much of that had come from his experience in Argentina. The final thing to say as well that I think people don't quite realise that he brought from his Argentinian experience was a kind of understanding of the pastoral complexities that people are living with, and the way in which the church really needed to be alongside people in the messiness and the complexity of their lives, that he was constantly dealing with poor people who would be turning up unmarried with children to be baptized, so that baptisms and marriages happened together, that you had many people not taking communion because they were in various forms of so-called irregular relationship situations, and he felt that the church needed to be much more responsive to those. And so he issued documents as a result of another synod process that he held that tried to make the church just more pastorally responsive to the messiness and the complexity of people's lives. And I think he was quite unafraid of that messiness and complexity. And again, I think that was a breath of fresh air, and unafraid of conflict and tensions, but maybe we'll come back to that.
Yeah. One of the things I often think about with Pope Francis is his kind of really great clarity that, you know, he did fail, but then he reflected on that and came back as a different person. You know, it's so countercultural today, isn't it? Because either you're a good leader or you're a disaster. And to have somebody like him who says, okay, no, I was a disaster, and then I reflected and I changed. There is just something about that which is so attractive and thought-provoking.
Yeah, definitely. And I think he realized that we're living in actually really quite a doctrinaire era, in which narratives of failure and forgiveness and a path back to some kind of restitution, we seem to have kind of removed from ourselves the option of having those paths in situations of complexity. So we end up reifying forms of purity, removing from our public register opportunities for credible narratives of forgiveness and restitution. And he was a model of exactly the opposite of all of those things. He was not looking for a purity culture, and he understood that people all the time fail and mess up and need pathways back into community. And actually community is strengthened rather than harmed by that process of restoring those who feel in some sense that they've failed, or even those who have wounded the community, back to the heart of the community. It's not a threat to the coherence of the community if you're a Christian.
So if we just kind of reflect now a little bit on what should start drawing Francis and Leo together in our conversation. So the other thing we haven't really touched on very much is that, of course, Francis was shaped by the Jesuit tradition, and Leo has been shaped by the Augustinian friar tradition. Could you just kind of reflect on how they can make a difference to the two different popes?
Yeah, and the first thing we should probably do is note that it's highly unusual to have two popes from religious orders. It was unusual in the modern era to have one pope from a religious order, let alone two in immediate sequence. So that's an extraordinary thing in itself. Francis was absolutely shaped by his Ignatian background and tradition. Not only by that, we should say as well, he had a great love of literature. He was really interested in the thinker Romano Guardini, who formed a lot of the background to his thinking about how we should go more deeply into the sites of tension and conflict and argument and difficulty rather than seeking to evade them. So there are other figures and thinkers who were important in traditions other than his Ignatian tradition, but his Ignatian tradition was really important. And I think although he didn't often talk about it as overtly as, say, Pope Leo talks about his Augustinian influences now, it was there absolutely in, for example, his absolute commitment to the act of discernment itself, the idea that you could pay attention to spiritual forces at work, the presence of good and evil in the world, that you could discern good spirits from bad spirits. And he used his Ignatian charism all the time to be reflecting deeply on how you could cooperate with those good spirits and how you could also other and keep at bay the bad spirits. So he was constantly looking at these Ignatian cycles of consolation and desolation, and deeply rooted in the scriptures. and in the contemplation of scripture. And he would come back again and again to these vivid preached portraits of scriptural passages that you could tell he'd simply inhabited so deeply within that Ignatian charism. So all of those things for him were, I think, really important. And for Leo now, obviously his own Augustinian background is huge. And I mean, you can almost play a game of sort of, you know, looking through Pope Leo's speeches and reflections and looking for the moment where you get a quick segue into St. Augustine. But he's making really interesting use of St. Augustine. And I think particularly interesting is his outreach to young people and his preaching to a sort of younger generation of Christians, using that Augustinian tradition of reflecting on the restlessness of the soul, on the deep need to commit to real goods and the pathway of truth. So he's drawing very deeply on his Augustinian heritage, I think, especially in that ministry to young people in a kind of social media digital age.
So we've been talking a little bit about Francis's background and how that shaped him. And what can we know about Pope Leo's background, and what can we be looking for in the way in which that shaped him?
So I think the fact that Leo comes from a religious order which is very committed to communal living, to a real depth of communal living. Leo is a man who is used to living in community, praying in community, eating in community, sleeping in community. So that sense of what does it take to be a person who lives well with others in a shared life, I think that's a really important part of simply what he has lived, his own lived experience of the last decades. So he's shaped by that notion of how do you keep a unified whole and let everybody flourish within that. So I think, I mean, there's a really interesting piece actually, just on the day that we're recording this, I realize it'll go out a little bit later, but Vatican News has a piece today in which they're reflecting on Leo as a pope committed to a church which is unified and open, and that those are sort of the two hallmarks, if you like, the predominant notes that Leo has struck so far, that he's absolutely determined to focus on the unity of the church as well as the openness of the church, and that for him there's no contradiction between those two things. And I do think that the lessons that enable him to reflect on that really stem from his own experience of living in community. The second thing we should say is that he is a missionary Augustinian, in the sense that his life has been lived as a missionary. His life has been lived, therefore, as a migrant missionary as well. So when he comments on migration issues and people say, oh, you know, why is he so focused on these things? I think we have to remember that he himself has been a migrant missionary and indeed a migrant bishop, at the heart of serving at the heart of a community that is not was not his country of origin, so in Peru. And I think he's really shaped by the sort of mission 101 experience of being in basic small communities, living very simply, surrounded by people who are also living very simply, and that you're having to build the church in both the sort of simplicity and the joy and also the complexity of that reality. So I think that's a really forming experience for him, and that he understands the church is most itself when it is involved in that missionary activity, and that it is there from an Augustinian perspective to share that truth throughout the nations of the world. And I think he shares that with Francis. I think sometimes one can draw too many contrasts between Leo and Francis. And I often hear people say, oh, the really important thing is that Leo talks about Christ more, or he's really focused on mission. So was Francis. I'm not sure that messaging always got through in quite the same way. So what's interesting to me is that Leo's messaging is much more clearly getting through, that he really is focused very much on a sort of, again, a missionary church that goes forth, but one that is united, that's focused on the communion of the shared life of the Christian community itself. And that the best sign that the church can give in an age of polarization and tension is its own capacity to do unity and diversity. And I think he's determined to lead by example. I think he, perhaps a little bit in contrast to Francis, is keener to give a message that the Pope himself, the Bishop of Rome, is himself somebody who will lead by walking with others. So I think his style is slightly less sort of decision making from above. And we've had this extraordinary period of waiting at the early phase of this papacy. So we're 6 months in, And there have been a couple of significant documents, but nonetheless, it's been a period marked by waiting, by, I think, careful listening and detailed preparation. That's a real contrast to Francis, who came in as a man in a real hurry. And of course, he came in the context of a crisis. Pope Benedict had resigned. So that was a very difficult moment for Francis to come into the papacy in. And he brought his own sense of personal urgency that we've already noted. Leo took over from Francis and therefore was not coming in a moment of the same kind of discombobulation and slight crisis feel that there was in the transition from Benedict to Francis. But he also has this very different set of dispositions. And I don't believe that he has quite the same sense. I think he has a sense of urgency, but he's not a man in a hurry in the same way.
So let's just talk a little bit about Pope Francis's encyclicals, and because let's start there. I was going to say, and then let's have a think about Leo, but let's start just with Francis. He published some really, really important encyclicals, didn't he? Can you just talk us through kind of the key themes that were kind of the focus of his time as Pope?
Yeah, so the first major document that he issued was called Evangelii Gaudium, the Joy of the Gospel. And that document was really his kind of manifesto for his papacy. And he set out in that document this vision of the church which is close to people, a church which is for all. So a church which is not a sort of small group moving through a narrow doorway, but this community on the move through history, and whose character could be understood as a field hospital, like a field hospital, moving, the church moving and capable of moving itself to the sites of human suffering, the sites of human need. And that could be spiritual suffering as well as kind of material suffering. But the church would find itself, if it was capable, of being a field hospital for the age and being utterly unafraid of being on the front lines of various of our cultural difficulties and challenges. So this was a kind of wide open church, a church on the move, a relatively informal church, if you like, but committed to sharing the joy of the gospel as a church that goes forth. So Evangelii Gaudium set that out. It also had quite an interesting section at the end where he offered this sort of 4-point vision for the common good and a sort of an ecclesial politics of the common good. So what I mean by that is these are 4 principles that apply within the life of the church, and they apply to society as well. And he named those, interestingly, as time is greater than space, meaning so much of modernity for him was about occupying spaces, that you create movements and initiatives that are all about showing they're all about appearance, and they're showing that you've got presence, and you colonize space. That's the kind of logic of modernity for him as a grand narrative. Whereas he thinks that the Christian way is the temporal way, to create good processes in time. And I think that's a really interesting insight, because one of the things that he was saying to Christians was basically, don't worry if it feels like everything's overwhelming. Don't worry if it feels like your initiative might fail. The important thing is start something, even if it's a small seed. And if it has goodness in it, it will in some sense maintain itself and grow over time. But this isn't about colonizing spaces. It's about initiating processes of the good in time, and you have the kind of longue durée in view for that. The second was unity prevails over conflict. He genuinely believed that the gift of unity, which comes from God, prevails in the end over all conflict, and that you need to be unafraid of going to the heart of what actually drives conflicts and sitting in that place of attending to what's really driving the conflict and understanding what might be a genuine tension that actually there's fruitfulness in engaging with, and what are simply death-dealing conflicts which have to be ceased. And then the third one was realities. This is quite challenging, especially if you're an academic like me. Realities are more important than ideas. The danger is that we can live in a world of our own fabrication in our heads. What a Christian is called to do is to attend to the reality of the world unflinchingly. And actually, that's one of the most demanding things as a Christian that we can do, is to look at reality as it truly is, both the beauty of that and also the extreme desolation that we're capable of and harm in history. And then the final one is the whole is greater than the part, so that the capacity for Christians to get bogged down in small questions rather than constantly looking to more open horizons. And he believed that sort of practically and spiritually, we were called to constantly look up, to broaden our horizons. And the image that he gave, just to finish this bit, was the image of the polyhedron, that we needed to stop thinking about centre and peripheries, and that we needed to think about our social realities and our ecclesial realities as like a polyhedron, where in the end there's a convergence of all of the parts. And that for me is quite an interesting set of principles to use to reflect on how you get towards a kind of ecclesial politics of the common good. And then very briefly, I suppose his other really big encyclicals were Laudato Si, which was focused particularly on the environment and ecology, although he himself would say it's not my environment encyclical. It's really a vision of a theology of creation, and how we're responsible for kind of living well, seeing the world as gift in all ways. And then Fratelli Tutti, which he saw as the counterpart to his environment encyclical that wasn't an environment encyclical. And his argument was that Laudato Si was about our common home, seeing the earth as our common home. And Fratelli Tutti was sort of part two of that, the sequel, in which he was talking about how we as human beings can live together well in our common home. So what are the challenges to human relationships and community formation and living well together once you've begun to realise that what we inhabit is a common home, for which we have to exercise sustainable responsibility.
And I know it's really early days yet, but have you got any kind of sense of where Leo's priorities are going to lie? Are there theological themes? You've mentioned about unity already. Are there other themes that come out?
Yeah, so I mean, I think for him, unity, peace, and the pursuit of truth are key themes that are emerging so far, that he repeats over and over again, and that's really coherent, both in terms of a gospel perspective, but also his Augustinian tradition. He has also focused already on the preferential option for the poor. He's just released a document, legacies, which is looking at the whole kind of history. It's got this extraordinary chapter in the middle, which is the sweep of Christian history of looking at questions of poverty as a theological question. So his argument is, just like you can never look at the reality of a migrant and think that's only ever a sociological question, a social question, because the Bible is basically a history of migration in various ways. So it's also true that you cannot look at questions of poverty as, if you're a Christian, as only a social or political question or economic question. It's always a theological question, because God says that God is close to the poorest in history. God reveals God's self preferentially to the poorest in history, and the challenge of overcoming aspects of poverty as a form of human harm is a responsibility that's directly and personally laid on the shoulders of Christians. And that responsibility is always personal and also always structural. And he gives this really impressive, very careful, steady, considered narrative of the Christian history of responding to poverty in that document, which was released only a few weeks ago. But it makes it absolutely clear that you cannot be a Christian and evade those questions. This is central to the question of Christian identity and the purpose of the church, and it's central to God's plan for how we live well in history. So that's become a kind of major text already, I think, that we can sort of use to reflect on. And of course, in the last week or so alone, he's been reflecting a lot out loud again on a critique of US politics. I think he's not interested in the culture wars. And I think journalists who are trying to portray him as sort of, wanting to enter into some battle with conservative American bishops or with Trump, I think he's got no interest in the culture wars. But I do think that he feels viscerally and personally the plight of people who are on the sharp end of the culture wars. So therefore, he's been very willing to speak up for migrants who are facing quite draconian policies around detention and expulsion from the US. And he's been willing to speak out on climate change, again, in a way absolutely consistent with Francis. So you could, you can't put a piece of paper between Francis and Leo on the environment, on poverty, on migration, on work, on inequalities. That they are simply orthodox versions of the Catholic social teaching tradition that goes back to 1891, and he's willingly making that part a public part of his papacy already. Whether there'll be an encyclical next year, maybe to mark the anniversary of Rerum Novarum, which would be in May, that will be interesting to see, and I think that would then be a much more systematic document for us to get hold of. And I also suspect that he'll want to issue some texts which are sort of more straightforwardly theological rather than simply social as well. So at the moment, we're at the end of this 6-month period, and we're slightly in the same mode of waiting and listening and attention that I think Leo himself is in. And I think that commitment to careful attention to the world before you make major appointments, before you release major documents, in a kind of attention deficit era where we want instant reactions, we want people to immediately disclose themselves. I think there's something intriguingly countercultural about his way of operating and revealing what this papacy will be like to us.
And one of the most newsworthy things that's happened of late for those who live in Britain has been the visit of King Charles to the Pope. And I think it's quite easy to forget quite what a momentous occasion that it was. So can you just talk us into why it's quite so important, and then maybe what it means?
Yeah, I mean, I'm 50 exactly this year, and if you're my age and you were a Catholic growing up in England and Wales, I don't think I thought that I would see in my lifetime a monarch, a British monarch at the heart of the Vatican, praying publicly with the Pope. I don't believe in my childhood or my adolescence that I would have thought that was a likely scenario. So I think it is a really significant and momentous moment. And I think that's partly the culmination of the relationship that Pope Francis had with Charles, that goes back some way. And I think one of the interesting things is that when this visit was originally planned, it would have been with Justin Welby as the Archbishop of Canterbury, Francis as the Pope. And so this happened, in a very different moment, because these things take a long time. They take sort of 2 years to plan. But the King wanted to go during the Jubilee year, the Jubilee for Hope, which is currently running this year in Rome. So in a sense, we can see it as an act of pilgrimage. We can see it as a desire for encounter and dialogue. We can see it as the culmination of 60 years of ecumenical dialogue. And I think this very public, personal moment between the Pope and the King, the people in the back room who made this possible, of whom, in fact, Paula, you're one, are the people who've made quiet, consistent commitments to ecumenical dialogue, Anglican Roman Catholic dialogue in the background. And that's happened at national level through English Arc, that's happened at international level through IARCM, through the pairing of bishops. Many people don't know that there's an entity that pairs Anglican and Roman Catholic bishops globally, the IARCM bishops, and that they accompany each other in their ministries in those localities, going all the way back to the personal friendships that structured the Malines conversations at the beginning of the 20th century that kind of faltered and then, in a sense, picked up again afterwards. So this is a moment that is not just 2 years in the preparation between the palace and the embassy in the Vatican, but it's also 60 years in preparation, in that opening up moment of the moment after the Second Vatican Council, where the Catholic Church threw open its doors again to a more committed form of open ecumenical dialogue. And it's a celebration of that. It's a culmination of that. It's a way marking point for what we would hope would become then a better quality of relationship, frankly, between Catholics and Anglicans in these aisles, as much as with the spectacle of a beautiful liturgy in a church in Rome.
And what do you think it means for kind of ordinary Anglicans? There are some of us have the great opportunity, and I absolutely loved my time which I spent on the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, talking at kind of high level. But most people don't get the opportunity to do the kind of big conversations. For ordinary Anglicans, what do you think that they should be thinking about at the moment?
So these were two baptized Christians who happened to occupy very significant roles as a Pope and a King, praying together in public. And interestingly, much of the day focused on the care for creation. So it focused on an ecological theme. The capacity for ordinary Anglicans and Catholics to pray together as often as possible, to see each other as fellow Christians, as fellow baptized believers, and to explore more deeply what it is possible for us to do together and where we have shared points of history. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting about, because I attended not the Sistine Chapel liturgy, but I attended the liturgy at St. Paul's Outside the Walls. And one of the reasons that St. Paul's Outside the Walls honoured King Charles with this extraordinarily beautiful carved chair and with the title of Confrater at the Abbey is because, in fact, there is a longer shared history of Anglicans and Catholics, Christians in these islands having a shared history before the divisions of the Reformation than since. So it celebrated the fact that we have a longer shared history than we have a history divided, and that most of us wish to find ways to overcome the divisions of that history. I am still one of the crazy people who believes that some form of full visible unity is what we're called to, and we struggle towards. So I think for a sense of renewal and energy, of finding what it is possible in this era to do together, and of refusing any division that isn't one that is absolutely necessary in terms of an honest pursuit of truth, are things that we should all frankly be committed to. And I think the possibility, I'm a political theologian, so I would say this, but the possibility to do much more witnessing in the area of social justice and direct social provision together, side by side, we could be doing so much more of that already.
And that brings me to my final question. We've been looking backwards, thinking about where we've come from. What excites you about the Catholic Church as you look forwards?
So, I mean, I would say this partly because I have been committed to the synod process, the synodal process of renewal that Pope Francis began, and which Leo is very much committed to continuing. But having watched the energy of that grassroots renewal, of people who, I mean, I'm one of the very few people who sat in the Vatican and read every single submission that came in from around the world. From any Catholic could write and submit their experience and their reflections to Rome as part of that process. And I read reflections from people who, particularly older women, so women in their 70s, 80s and 90s, who wrote and said, I never thought that the church would want to hear my opinion or my experience. I'm overwhelmed to be asked to share my experience. And it moved me to see the energy and the joy, as well as some of the grief and sorrow that was expressed in those submissions. And I think having animated that at a global level, I want to see that that energy and that passion for that sense that we are all co-responsible for mission. This isn't something the clergy do alone and the rest of us go out to work. This is a baptismal co-responsibility for the sharing of the joy of the gospel in mission to all. And I see that with such vibrancy and cultural diversity in the Catholic community globally. And I want to see that energy continued. I'm also very struck by what some are calling the quiet revival. My parish church on a Sunday has people out the doors now on a Sunday evening because there is this desire, particularly from a younger generation, but not only, for what the Christian message can offer them and what Christian community can offer them. And I think particularly in a post-pandemic moment where people are hungry again for real human interaction, for face-to-face relationships, for something that actually is meaningful and worthy of living your life towards and within the framework of, I think we have an enormous possibility in this moment to draw people close to a message that very often now people have very little prior experience of, because they've been brought up without any real contact with the church. And I see a huge potential and energy for that in Catholic communities at the moment. And then finally, a real openness, I think, also to exploring the question, which again, the Synod raised, of the ways in which the Catholic Church can be working on its inclusion and recognition of women in all roles throughout the life of the Church. That was one of the sort of global reflections that came back from that synod process, alongside, please could you improve the quality of preaching? So please could you improve the quality of preaching? Please can you make proper Christian formation available for all people at all ages and stages of life and accompany families as family units? And please, for goodness sake, can you work on the ways in which the church is capable of drawing on and recognising the gifts, callings, charisms, vocations of every baptized person? I'm very enthusiastic about those possibilities.
Sounds good to me. Anna, it's been absolutely fabulous talking to you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.